So, Lone Rider here, and I want to give just a brief overview of my Musashi Hand Honed Katana. Now, I've had this for a few days, and the news kind of worn off. So, um, take a look at this thing. Now, the blade's a little over 28 inches from the guard, from the suba to the tip. It was advertised as having a 26 and a fraction of an inch blade, so I don't know if they got that wrong or if they maybe they just start measuring after this brass piece here because that's not actually, part of the cutting edge. Um, Everything still feels tight. I've cut enough water bottles to fill an entire garbage can, and then some. Um, and I've been pretty much using this every day, either just swinging it and getting a feel for it or actually cutting with it. Um, I still don't cut very well. I'm still getting the hang of, putting a little bit of a pull into the cut so that it doesn't, so that it slices properly. But the edge is still sharp, and I've been wiping it off after every time I use it, and taking care of it. So um, now the blade does show um, marks. Um, Most notably, this part of the blade up here. You can see some faint. I don't know if you call them scratches, but you can see some markings there where the camera might not be picking it up, but basically from here to here, there's like some fine striations on the surface. That's the part that it seems to be cutting with mostly, so I guess it kind of makes sense. Um, Overall, what do I think of this? Well, it's a budget sword, and for what it costs, it does its job. It's not supposed to be ornate or pretty, although I think there's a certain aesthetically pleasing quality to the blade, regardless of the fittings. So, I mean, this could have a plain wood handle or shirasaya. This could have a fancier handle. The blade itself is still going to be pretty cool to look at. And, it's a functional sword. It's my first sharp functional sword. I would say for the price, I'm actually impressed so far. I did flub a couple cuts, and the blade isn't bent as far as I can tell. Um, it still sits straight. Um, I do know that these aren't spring hardened like a medieval sword or a modern saber. So you do have to be careful of them. But it has a nice heft to it. I was actually surprised. The blade was longer than I said, longer than I thought. Like I said, I thought it was going to be 26 and a fraction of an inch long. It's actually from here to the tip 28. So that may be helping me with the cuts in terms of it. It has a little more weight behind it and mass, but at the same time, it is different than using a longsword. It's a two-handed sword, so you still get that part of the interface between me and the sword is still the same in that respect. But it is very different than a sparring sword because I spar with a longsword. I practice with a longsword. I don't do Japanese martial arts, so that's something that's very different. And also the fact that the sword itself is sharp. I've never had a sharp sword before, so certain things just about the handling, you have to be careful. Just one example, I had this in the sheath, the saya, and I was taking it out, and the saya started to slip, and I went to grab it, and it had already slipped further back, and at that point what was under my hand was bare blade, and I just grabbed bare blade. Now, as soon as I realized what I'd done, I immediately just let go and lifted my hand straight up. If I had tried to jerk my hand away to the side or pull it off, I probably would have gotten a nice draw cut across my palm. As it was, I did get a line pressed into my hand from the edge of the blade, but it didn't get cut, and I was very lucky. Now, I'm somebody who considers myself, as a noob, fairly competent with swords for a noob, but again, I've only ever used blunt swords. So in terms of handling them in such a way as, not to hurt somebody inadvertently or be careful with them or break the lamp. I don't consider myself somebody who's likely to necessarily do that sort of thing because I have been practicing with longsword for a few months now. Um, but I'd never handled a sharp sword before, and there's considerations with a sharp sword that you have to have. It's kind of like the difference between an airsoft gun and a real firearm. If you screw up with a sharp sword, the penalty's a lot bigger because somebody could get really hurt or killed. Whereas, with a blunt sword, I mean, you could still get seriously hurt or potentially even killed with a blunt sword, but it's less likely. Um, and I mean, one of the reasons that swords are so effective is because you have a massive striking edge. So you can hit with pretty much any part of the blade. Obviously, certain parts of the blade are optimized for hitting with, like down here. But theoretically, the whole part of the blade is edged. So it gives you a greater chance of making a cutting contact with your target, even if you don't hit the exact spot. Whereas something like an axe, the head is a lot weightier and it's going to chop better and have a lot of more mass behind it. But the blade of the axe is less in length than the blade of the sword in terms of the edge. So it might be harder to land that cut on the part you're trying to hit. With a sword, you have a little more leeway in that department. You just don't have all the mass behind it. But that also has its benefit too. A sword's lighter. It's more nimble in the hand. It's easier to use defensively. Axes were sometimes used in combat, but often with shields. I mean, so were swords, to be fair. But uh, with axes, it almost became a necessity because you couldn't really defend very well with an axe. Whereas with a sword, you can attack and defend with the sword. And something like longsword, it's a single-use item. You don't use it with a sword or a shield or a buckler or anything else in the offhand. The sword is both your weapon of attack and defense. And ironically, the same is true of katanas and Japanese swords generally. So, but yeah, it is a very different weapon. The fact that it is a functional weapon, an edged weapon, um, you know, um, you can inflict harm a lot easier with something that's edged because all you got to do is hit. You don't even have to hit very hard, and it will cut. Whereas with something like an axe or a mace, you really have to put a lot of oomph behind it. And I mean, the axe will cut too, but it's more of a percussive or hitty weapon. I mean, a sword you could just lay on something and then pull or push, and it will cut. And the truth is that this sword, I've never had a sharp sword before, so to me, the whole idea of not wanting to inadvertently do that, um, yeah, there's just a whole other set of etiquette, I guess, that you have to keep in mind when you're dealing with sharp swords. So now that the news worn off, what do I think of my first sword? Well, first of all, I'm very impressed with that it's holding up, considering how much it cost. A stainless steel wall hanger would have broken by now. Um, I will say it's been a learning experience, and no doubt I'll go through the same learning experience when I get a sharp medieval sword that's more similar to the longsword that I practice with. Excuse me. Um, like I said, I am kind of disappointed in some of the. There's only really two aspects of the fittings. There's the fact that this cap on the handle, the suka, is not. Um, it's not perfectly level. It's kind of off a little bit. And then there's the fact that these bolsters, when you look at the bottom of the tsuba or guard, these little brass washers or bolsters stick out more on this side than that side. Now they line up with each other. The top one does the same, but so they're symmetrical in that sense, but they're not symmetrical in terms of being lined up with the suka. But again, I mean, for what the sword costs, you're basically buying the blade and the tsuba or discard. The quality of the handle fittings, this is something you buy because you want a first sword to cut with. It's not a display piece. So, for what it is, I'm very happy with it. I am kind of surprised that the blade is longer than they advertised. Um, one of the shortcomings people often say about the katana compared to other swords is that it is a shorter. It's a two-handed sword, but it's a fairly short sword compared to a lot of long swords have, you know, 30-something inch blades, whereas the blades on these tend to end around 30 inches, so 28 inches or something like that. Now, I thought I was buying, like I said, the 26 and 3/4 or something inch blade. It's only 26 and something inches if you measure from where this brass piece ends, so the actual cutting edge. If you start at the guard, as we normally do with Western swords, the blade is 28 and a fraction of an inch long. Um, so in terms of, where I'm thinking the blade begins, uh, it actually is about 2 inches longer. But if they only measure where the bolster ends, then it's the appropriate length. I don't know. But anyway, uh, that's my take on it. I'm very happy with this, and I'm very psyched. I hope it holds up. Um, so far nothing's come badly loose or starting to wiggle. So the blade is still straight, and still has an edge. Um, so yeah, that's what I think so far after the news worn off.